He tore up her check and mocked her worn bag in front of everyone. She walked out in tears, humiliated. What he didn't know? She owned the bank, and that old bag he ridiculed held the memory of her dead son. Justice was coming now. For 15 years, Marcus Harrison had perfected the art of walking through Riverside Bank like he owned every marble tile beneath his Italian leather shoes. That Tuesday morning, as he stepped through the glass doors of the downtown branch, he radiated a confidence that could be felt from across the room. At 38 years old, he had built a reputation that made him untouchable, the most successful branch manager in the entire region, responsible for bringing in wealthy clients whose accounts added millions to the bank's portfolio, and the proud owner of a corner office that overlooked the most prestigious street in the city. His tailored charcoal suit, custom-made by a designer whose name he dropped at every opportunity, fit his athletic frame with precision. The Rolex on his wrist caught the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, sending small reflections dancing across the pristine white walls. His smile, perfected through years of networking events and carefully calculated social interactions, revealed teeth so white they could have been used in toothpaste commercials. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," murmured Jennifer Martinez, the head teller, automatically straightening her posture as he passed. Her voice carried the cautious tone of someone who had learned that any interaction with Marcus could either elevate or destroy their day. Marcus offered barely a nod in response, his attention already fixed on his phone, where notifications about his investment portfolio blinked with satisfying green numbers. Why waste precious time on pleasantries with employees whose annual salaries barely matched what he spent on his monthly car payment? Over the years, Marcus had developed a very clear philosophy about humanity. People existed in two categories. There were winners like himself who deserved respect, admiration, and immediate service wherever they went. Then there were the others, the ordinary, forgettable masses who existed primarily to make his life more convenient. There were no shades of gray in Marcus Harrison's world, only black and white, success and failure, important and irrelevant. As he made his way toward his office, Marcus mentally reviewed his agenda for the day. 3 meetings with high-net-worth clients, a conference call with regional directors, and a lunch appointment at the city's most exclusive restaurant with a real estate developer whose business could bring in another $2 million in deposits. Everything was falling into place exactly as he had planned. Today's going to be another perfect day, he told himself, adjusting his silk tie with satisfaction. But his carefully constructed morning was about to be interrupted in a way that would change everything. The heavy glass door of the bank swung open with a soft whoosh, and a woman entered who immediately drew Marcus's attention for all the wrong reasons. She moved slowly, with the careful steps of someone whose joints protested every movement. Her clothing was clean, but clearly old, the kind of practical garments that had been washed and mended countless times. A floral print dress that had faded from years of wear hung loosely on her thin frame, and a cardigan with small pills of fabric covered her shoulders despite the warm morning temperature. But what caught Marcus's eye most forcefully was the bag she carried. It was a leather purse that had clearly seen better days, decades ago. The brown leather was cracked and worn, the handles darkened by years of grip, and one corner showed signs of an old repair done with careful but unprofessional stitching. It was the kind of bag that most people would have thrown away years ago, the kind that practically screamed poverty and struggle. The woman was Dorothy Washington, though Marcus hadn't bothered to learn her name yet. At 68 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed completely at odds with her humble appearance. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her face, though lined with the marks of time and hardship, held an expression of peaceful determination. As Dorothy approached the teller counter with measured steps, several customers in line glanced at her and then quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the visible poverty she represented. In a bank that catered primarily to the wealthy professionals and business owners of downtown, her presence felt almost like an intrusion into a world where she didn't belong. Jennifer Martinez greeted her with the professional courtesy that all bank employees were trained to show, though her smile carried a hint of uncertainty. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" "Good morning, dear," Dorothy replied with a warmth that seemed to come from somewhere deep and genuine. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying the slight rasp of age. "I'd like to make a deposit, please." From inside her worn leather bag, Dorothy carefully extracted a folded envelope. With hands that trembled slightly, whether from age, nervousness, or both, she opened it and removed a check. She placed it on the counter with the gentle reverence of someone handling something precious. Jennifer picked up the check, and her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Marcus, who had been watching the interaction from across the lobby with growing irritation at how long this woman was taking at the counter, noticed the teller's reaction. Something about it triggered his instinct for potential problems. He moved closer, his curiosity shifting rapidly toward suspicion. The check was for $50,000. Jennifer looked from the check to Dorothy and back again, clearly uncertain how to proceed. The amount was substantial, but the woman standing before her looked like she could barely afford bus fare. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. "Ma'am," Jennifer began carefully, her training warring with her instincts. "This is quite a large amount. Can you tell me where this check came from?" "It's from the settlement of my late husband's estate," Dorothy explained simply, her voice steady despite the personal nature of the information. "He passed 6 months ago, and the lawyers have finally finished processing everything." Marcus, who had positioned himself close enough to overhear the conversation, felt his suspicion crystallize into certainty. This was clearly some kind of scam. Women who looked like they shopped at thrift stores didn't suddenly walk in with $50,000 checks. It was obvious to anyone with half a brain. "Excuse me," Marcus interjected, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority as he stepped directly up to the counter. His imposing presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the interaction. "I'm Marcus Harrison, the branch manager. Is there a problem here?" Jennifer looked relieved to have someone else take responsibility for the situation. "Mr. Harrison, this customer is attempting to deposit a check for $50,000, and I was just verifying." "Let me see that," Marcus interrupted, holding out his hand with an expectation of immediate compliance. Dorothy watched silently as the manager took her check, studying it with eyes that seemed to be looking for evidence of fraud rather than legitimacy. Something in his expression, in the curl of his lip and the narrowing of his eyes, made her heart sink with the familiar weight of judgment. Marcus examined the check theatrically, holding it up to the light as if looking for watermarks, though he had no actual training in detecting forgeries. After what felt like an eternity, he turned his attention to Dorothy, with a look that made her feel about 2 inches tall. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension, "do you really expect us to believe this check is legitimate?" "Yes, sir," Dorothy replied, confusion mixing with the first stirrings of hurt. "The law firm that handled my husband's estate issued it. Everything is documented." "Documented," Marcus repeated with a laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Lady, I've been in banking for 15 years. I've seen every scam, every con, every pathetic attempt to defraud honest institutions. And this?" He waved the check dismissively. "This has fraud written all over it." Dorothy felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as other customers in the bank began to take notice of the confrontation. Conversations died away, and heads turned toward the counter where she stood. The weight of multiple gazes pressed down on her shoulders like physical objects. "Sir, I assure you, everything is legitimate," Dorothy tried again, her voice quieter now but still maintaining its dignity. "I have other documentation in my bag if you need to verify." "Your bag," Marcus seized on the words like a predator spotting wounded prey. His eyes locked onto the worn leather purse she clutched against her chest. "Speaking of which, let's talk about that bag for a moment." He moved closer, invading her personal space in a way that made Dorothy instinctively step back. His voice grew louder, ensuring that everyone in the bank could hear clearly. "That bag looks like it survived 2 world wars and a natural disaster. What are you carrying in there? More fake checks? Stolen credit cards? Food stamps?" A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the watching crowd, and Dorothy felt something crack inside her chest. But Marcus was just getting started, feeding off the attention like it was oxygen. "Let me guess," he continued, his voice taking on a cruel mockery that seemed designed to inflict maximum pain. "You found this check in a dumpster somewhere, or maybe you stole it from a mailbox. Did you really think you could just walk into my bank looking like—" He gestured at her outfit with obvious disdain, "like you just finished cleaning someone's house and we'd just hand you $50,000. "Mr. Harrison," Jennifer interjected softly, discomfort clear in her voice. Perhaps we should verify the check through proper channels before— Before what? Marcus snapped at his employee. Before we waste the bank's time and resources on an obvious scam? No, Jennifer. What we're going to do is what should have been done the moment she walked through that door. He turned back to Dorothy, and in one swift, brutal motion, he tore the check in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the silence of the bank like a gunshot. Before Dorothy could react, he tore it again and again, reducing the check to confetti that he let fall onto the marble floor like contemptuous snow. "That's what we do with fraud at Riverside Bank," Marcus declared triumphantly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We don't tolerate it, we don't enable it, and we certainly don't reward people who think they can take advantage of us." Dorothy stood frozen, staring at the pieces of paper scattered at her feet. Each fragment represented not just money, but her late husband's legacy, the financial security she desperately needed, and in this moment, her dignity being shredded as thoroughly as the check itself. Tears began to well in her eyes, but she blinked them back with fierce determination. After 68 years of life, after surviving poverty, loss, and more heartbreak than any person should endure, she had learned how to maintain her composure even when everything inside her was breaking. "Sir," Dorothy's voice trembled but remained steady, "you've made a terrible mistake." "The only mistake," Marcus shot back, "was you thinking you could pull this off. Now, I suggest you pick up your fraudulent trash and leave before I call the police." The gathered customers and employees watched in horrified fascination as Dorothy slowly bent down, her joints protesting with each movement, and began gathering the torn pieces of her check. Her hands shook as she collected each fragment, placing them carefully back into her worn leather bag. When she finally straightened up, meeting Marcus's eyes one last time, he saw something in her gaze that should have warned him. It wasn't defeat or shame. It was something far more dangerous, quiet certainty mixed with profound sadness. "You have no idea what you've just done," Dorothy said softly, clutching her bag against her chest. "No idea at all." Then she turned and walked toward the exit with as much dignity as she could muster, her shoulders straight despite the humiliation, her head held high despite the tears that now flowed freely down her weathered cheeks. As the heavy glass door closed behind her, Marcus turned to face the bank lobby with a satisfied expression. Let that be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can commit fraud at Riverside Bank. We protect our clients and our institution from people like that. Several customers nodded approvingly, though others looked distinctly uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. Jennifer Martinez avoided eye contact entirely, busying herself with papers at her station. Marcus returned to his office feeling like a conquering hero, completely unaware that he had just made the biggest mistake of his entire life. What he couldn't have known, what none of them knew, was that the worn leather bag Dorothy carried contained far more than torn check pieces. It contained documents that would destroy Marcus Harrison's world completely, and the reckoning was coming sooner than anyone could imagine. The rest of that Tuesday afternoon unfolded with Marcus Harrison's usual efficiency and confidence. He conducted 3 separate meetings with high-net-worth clients, each conversation reinforcing his sense of superiority and control. His lunch at the city's most expensive steakhouse had been perfect, the wine exquisite, and the conversation with fellow executives satisfying in its mutual admiration of success and wealth. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Marcus had almost completely forgotten about the embarrassing incident with the elderly woman and her obviously fraudulent check. Almost, but not entirely. Something about the way Dorothy had looked at him before leaving the bank, that strange mixture of profound sadness and quiet certainty in her weathered eyes, kept flickering at the edges of his consciousness like a stubborn candle flame that refused to be extinguished no matter how hard he tried to blow it out. But Marcus pushed the uncomfortable feeling aside with practiced ease. It was probably just another manipulation tactic that experienced con artists perfected over years of deceiving kind-hearted fools who let emotions cloud their judgment. Well, Marcus Harrison was nobody's fool. He had built his entire career on cold, rational decision-making untainted by sentiment. He was reviewing quarterly profit reports on his computer, admiring the impressive numbers that reflected his branch's performance, when his desk phone rang with a tone he recognized immediately, the direct line from regional headquarters. Marcus glanced at the caller identification and felt a small surge of satisfaction wash over him. This was probably Robert Thompson, the regional director, calling to congratulate him on another exceptional month of meeting and exceeding all performance targets. "Marcus Harrison speaking," he answered with his most confident and professional tone. "Marcus." The voice on the other end was definitely Robert Thompson's, but something in his tone made Marcus's satisfaction evaporate instantly, like morning dew under scorching sunlight. Robert sounded stressed in a way Marcus had never heard before in their 15 years of professional association. "I need you in my office, immediately. Drop everything." "Of course, Robert." "Is this about the quarterly numbers? I can explain the—" "Now, Marcus, get here right now." The line went dead with a sharp click that echoed in Marcus's ear like a gunshot. Marcus stared at the silent phone for several long seconds, confusion mixing rapidly with the first genuine tendrils of real concern snaking through his chest. In 15 years of methodically climbing the corporate ladder, rung by careful rung, he had never heard Robert sound like that. The regional director was always composed, methodical, predictable, almost boring in his consistent professionalism. But the voice that had just spoken carried something that sounded disturbingly like barely controlled panic. The drive to regional headquarters normally took a comfortable 30 minutes through city traffic, but Marcus made it in 20, weaving through lanes with uncharacteristic aggression, his mind racing through countless possibilities. A major client complaint about his management style, some kind of unexpected regulatory investigation into branch procedures, perhaps one of his subordinates had made a catastrophic error that reflected badly on his leadership capabilities. Each possibility seemed worse than the last. When he finally arrived at the imposing glass and steel building that housed the regional offices, Marcus noticed something unusual immediately. Robert's executive assistant, Sarah Chen, who was typically the absolute picture of professional calm and efficiency, looked visibly shaken when she saw him approach. Her normally steady hands trembled slightly as she gestured wordlessly toward the large conference room at the end of the corridor. "He's waiting for you inside," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, still not quite meeting Marcus's increasingly worried eyes. "Mr. Harrison, good luck." Good luck? What the hell was going on? The phrase sent ice water through Marcus's veins. Marcus opened the heavy conference room door and found Robert Thompson standing rigidly by the floor-to-ceiling windows, hands clasped tightly behind his back, staring out at the city skyline below with the unmistakable posture of a man who had just received utterly catastrophic news. The regional director was 55 years old, with distinguished silver hair and an impressive reputation built over decades for never losing his composure under even the most intense pressure. But right now, at this very moment, his shoulders sagged visibly under the weight of something heavy and terrible. "Robert," Marcus began carefully, trying desperately to inject some confidence into his increasingly uncertain voice. "What's this emergency meeting about?" Robert turned slowly, almost reluctantly, and Marcus felt his stomach drop sickeningly. The older man's face had gone completely ashen, drained of all color, and his normally sharp eyes held a disturbing mixture of disbelief, barely contained fury, and something that looked terrifyingly like genuine fear. "Sit down, Marcus. I'd honestly prefer to stand if that's—" "Sit down. Now." The command carried such unexpected force that Marcus found himself obeying automatically before his brain could even process the decision. Robert moved to the massive conference table with slow, deliberate steps, like someone approaching an execution they couldn't avoid. He placed a thick manila folder on the polished surface between them, then stood there in complete silence for what felt like an unbearable eternity, as if gathering every ounce of courage to speak the words he needed to say. "Marcus, I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to be completely, absolutely honest with me. This morning, did you have any kind of interaction with an elderly woman at your branch location?" The small flame of unease that had been flickering in Marcus's mind suddenly roared into a massive bonfire of dread. "Yes, but Robert, it was nothing serious. Just routine fraud prevention procedures. Some elderly lady attempted to deposit what was clearly a fake check for $50,000. I handled the situation exactly as our protocols demand. I protected the bank's interests. Tell me exactly how you handled it." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. "I questioned the authenticity of the check thoroughly. When it became abundantly clear she was attempting fraud, I took appropriate action." I destroyed the fraudulent check and firmly asked her to leave the premises before involving law enforcement. You destroyed it, Robert repeated slowly, carefully, as if each word was coated in deadly poison. Tell me something, Marcus. Did you bother to verify that check through any proper official channels before you physically tore it up in front of witnesses? It was obviously fraudulent, Robert. The woman looked like she couldn't afford a basic bus ticket, much less legitimately have access to that kind of substantial money. I made a professional judgment call based on 15 years of banking experience and pattern recognition. Robert opened the folder with hands that shook noticeably, visibly trembling. He extracted several official-looking documents and spread them across the table surface like damning evidence at a criminal trial. Marcus leaned forward, squinting, trying desperately to make sense of what he was seeing. Stock certificates with official seals, complex legal documents covered in signatures, property deeds for valuable real estate. And there, positioned prominently at the center of it all, a professional photograph of an elderly woman in a simple dress, clutching a worn leather bag against her chest. Dorothy Washington. Marcus! Robert's voice had gone dangerously, ominously quiet. The kind of terrible quiet that always precedes a massive explosion. Do you have any idea who this woman actually is? Some con artist who was trying to... Her name is Dorothy Washington. Her late husband, Thomas Washington, personally founded this entire bank 42 years ago. The world seemed to tilt violently sideways. Marcus felt his mouth go completely dry, his heart beginning to pound frantically against his ribs, like a desperate prisoner trying to escape confinement. Thomas built Riverside Bank from absolutely nothing, Robert continued relentlessly, mercilessly, each carefully chosen word hammering another iron nail into Marcus's professional coffin. He started with a single modest location and grew it systematically into the impressive regional powerhouse it is today. When Thomas died 6 months ago, he left absolutely everything to his devoted wife. Dorothy Washington now personally owns 68% of Riverside Bank's controlling shares. She is, for all practical purposes, your ultimate employer. No, Marcus whispered weakly, but the word carried no force behind it whatsoever. That's completely impossible. She looked like some homeless person. Like what exactly, Marcus? Like someone who didn't deserve your basic respect? Like someone whose check you could destroy without any consequences? Marcus felt bitter bile rising dangerously in his throat. His vision narrowed to tunnel-like focus on the damning documents spread before him. Every single one confirmed the absolute nightmare Robert was methodically describing. Dorothy Washington wasn't just wealthy. She was the majority owner of the entire banking institution that employed him. The check you destroyed, Robert continued, his voice harsh and cutting, was issued by Henderson and Associates, the state's most prestigious law firm. It was from Thomas Washington's estate settlement. Everything was completely legitimate. I didn't know. How could I have known? She never identified herself. She looked poor. Poor? She looked poor. So you assumed she was a criminal? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no defense. He had judged Dorothy Washington entirely on appearance and decided she was beneath consideration. There's more, Robert said, his tone growing darker. Mrs. Washington has been visiting our branches for the past month, always dressed simply. Do you know why? Marcus shook his head slowly, now completely incapable of speech. Because she wanted to see with her own eyes how our employees actually treat customers who don't arrive in expensive designer suits driving luxury automobiles. She wanted to understand whether her late husband's core values survived, treating absolutely every customer with dignity and respect, regardless of their apparent financial status. The devastating implication crashed over Marcus like a massive tidal wave. This hadn't been some random encounter. This had been a deliberate test of character, and he had failed spectacularly, publicly, with multiple witnesses. Mrs. Washington called me exactly 30 minutes after leaving your branch this morning, Robert continued, pulling out yet another official document. She was crying, Marcus. Crying so desperately hard she could barely speak coherently. She said your cruel words and harsh actions reminded her of the single worst day of her entire life. Marcus looked up sharply, genuine fear flooding through him. What do you mean by that? Robert's stern expression softened slightly, but only to make space for deeper, more profound sadness. 23 years ago, Dorothy and Thomas had a son, Daniel. their only child, the absolute light of their lives. When Daniel was just 25 years old, he was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. Marcus felt his heart constrict painfully in his chest. The treatment was experimental, extremely expensive, and not covered by any insurance. They needed an emergency bridge loan to start treatment immediately. Thomas went to his own bank for help. A manager named Gerald Pritchard reviewed the numbers and decided lending money to save a life wasn't sound business. He denied the loan. 3 weeks passed. Daniel deteriorated. He died 4 months later. Tears began streaming down Marcus's cheeks, hot and unstoppable. He saw the horrifying parallel with crystalline clarity. Dorothy carried that unbearable trauma for 23 years. That bag she carries was Daniel's Christmas gift to her. And you mocked it, called it trash. God, Marcus whispered, what have I done? Your employment is terminated immediately. Security will escort you out. Marcus nodded numbly. Mrs. Washington wants you to understand what being judged feels like. She hopes you'll learn something. Security escorted Marcus out past staring co-workers. He was leaving more than a job, leaving a life built on arrogance. Somewhere, Dorothy sat holding her son's gift, crying. The question remained whether Marcus could change, or become another Gerald Pritchard. The 3 months following Marcus Harrison's termination from Riverside Bank were the darkest period of his entire life. What happened that Tuesday morning in the conference room with Robert Thompson was only the beginning of a catastrophic collapse that would strip away every single piece of the carefully constructed life he had spent 15 years building. The security escort from regional headquarters had been humiliating enough, but nothing could have prepared Marcus for what came next. By the time he arrived home that evening, still wearing his expensive suit that now felt like a costume from someone else's life, the news of his termination had already spread through the entire banking community like wildfire through dry timber. His wife, Catherine, was waiting in their living room when he walked through the door. She sat on their designer couch, phone in her lap, face carefully composed, barely concealing the fury beneath. Catherine Harrison had married Marcus because he represented security, status, and upward mobility. She had selected him like a reliable investment, and now that investment had catastrophically defaulted. Is it true? Catherine asked, her voice cold. She didn't stand, didn't move, just stared at him with judging eyes. Catherine, I can explain everything. There was a misunderstanding at the branch, and is it true that you humiliated an elderly woman? That you tore up her legitimate check? That the woman turned out to be the bank's majority owner? Each question was delivered like a prosecuting attorney presenting damning evidence to a jury. Marcus felt his knees weaken. How did you already know about... It's everywhere, Marcus. Everywhere. My phone hasn't stopped ringing for the past 2 hours. Every single one of my friends has called to ask if the Marcus Harrison being discussed all over social media is my husband. The Marcus Harrison who publicly mocked and degraded a 68-year-old woman. The Marcus Harrison who destroyed her property based purely on how poor she looked. It wasn't like that. I was following protocol. I was protecting the bank from what? From a woman who owns the entire institution? Catherine stood finally, and Marcus could see her hands trembling with barely controlled rage. Do you have any idea what you've done? Not just to yourself, but to me? To us? I have a career, Marcus. I have a reputation in this community. And now everyone associates me with the monster who became a viral story about banking cruelty and discrimination. Monster? Catherine, that's completely unfair. I made a mistake, yes, but calling me a mistake? Catherine's voice rose sharply. A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill or showing up late to a meeting. What you did was reveal who you actually are underneath all the expensive suits and fake charm. You showed everyone that you're exactly the kind of person who judges human worth by appearance and treats people you consider beneath you with contempt. The words struck Marcus like physical blows, because they were true. Every single syllable was devastatingly, undeniably true. I've already called my attorney, Catherine continued, moving toward the staircase with purpose. He's drawing up separation papers. I want you out of this house by tomorrow morning. You can stay at a hotel tonight. I don't care where, but I will not sleep under the same roof as you. Catherine, please. We've been married for 12 years. Doesn't that mean anything? She paused on the third step, turning to look down at him with an expression devoid of any warmth or recognition. I married a successful bank manager who I thought had integrity and intelligence. That person doesn't exist anymore. Maybe he never did. I'm not interested in being married to whoever you actually are." That night, Marcus checked into a budget hotel near the highway, unable to afford anything better since Catherine had immediately frozen their joint accounts. He lay awake on scratchy sheets that smelled of industrial detergent, staring at his phone as notification after notification popped up. Someone had posted about the incident on social media, and it had gone viral with terrifying speed. There were already think pieces being written about banking discrimination, class prejudice, and the treatment of elderly customers. His face wasn't in the viral posts, but his name was. Marcus Harrison, branch manager, Riverside Bank. The details were all there, spread across thousands of shares and comments, each one adding another layer to his public destruction. By morning, his phone was filled with messages from former colleagues, most of them variations of the same theme. "I can't believe you did this," or "I always knew you were arrogant, but this is beyond belief," or simply, "You deserve everything you get." The job search began immediately because Marcus needed income desperately. Without Catherine's salary, and with their accounts frozen pending the divorce proceedings, he was surviving on credit cards and rapidly dwindling savings. He sent his resume to every bank within a 100-mile radius, confident that his 15 years of experience and impressive track record would open doors despite this unfortunate incident. Every single door slammed shut in his face. The first rejection email came within hours. "Thank you for your interest, but we're pursuing other candidates who better fit our institutional values." The second came the next day. "After careful consideration and thorough background checks, we've decided to move forward with other applicants." By the end of the first week, Marcus had received 17 rejections. By the end of the second week, banks had stopped responding at all. His name had become toxic in the industry, a cautionary tale that every human resources department recognized instantly. Marcus expanded his search beyond banking to financial consulting, investment firms, even insurance companies. Anything that might utilize his skills and experience. The results were identical. No one wanted to hire the man who had become synonymous with prejudice and poor judgment. Within 6 weeks of his termination, Marcus had burned through his savings completely. Catherine's attorneys had been ruthlessly efficient, securing court orders that gave her the house, both cars, and the majority of their liquid assets. Marcus found himself living in a tiny studio apartment in a neighborhood he would have previously driven through without stopping, in a building where the hallways smelled of cooking oil, and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument and crying baby. The apartment cost $800 monthly, which seemed impossibly cheap until Marcus realized it was more than he could afford with zero income. He needed work, any work, immediately. Pride, that precious commodity he had hoarded for nearly 4 decades, became a luxury Marcus could no longer afford. He took the first job he could find, delivery driver for a local restaurant consortium. $10 per hour plus tips, which rarely materialized because most orders were prepaid through apps. He worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days weekly, delivering food to people who lived in the kinds of homes he had owned just weeks earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent 15 years looking down on service workers, and now he was one. The universe had a cruel sense of poetic justice. 3 months after his termination, Marcus was working an evening shift, delivering Thai food to an apartment complex across town. His back ached from hours of driving, his feet hurt from running orders up endless flights of stairs, and his soul felt hollowed out from the sheer degradation of his circumstances. He was walking through the parking lot toward his beat-up Honda Civic, the only car he'd been able to afford after selling everything of value, when he saw her. Dorothy Washington was loading grocery bags into the trunk of a modest sedan. She wore the same kind of simple clothing Marcus remembered from that terrible day at the bank, and she carried the same worn leather bag that he had so cruelly mocked. Marcus froze completely, his heart hammering hard against his ribs. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run, to avoid this confrontation at all costs. But something kept his feet rooted to the asphalt. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the desperate human need for some kind of resolution. Maybe it was simply exhaustion from carrying the weight of shame for 3 solid months. Dorothy looked up from her groceries, and their eyes met across 20 feet of parking lot. Marcus watched her expression shift through recognition, surprise, and something he couldn't quite identify. Not anger, which he deserved. Not satisfaction at seeing him brought low, which would have been understandable. Something softer and infinitely more complicated. Mr.
Harrison,
Dorothy said quietly, straightening up from her trunk. She didn't smile, but neither did her face harden with judgment. Mrs. Washington. Marcus's voice came out barely above a whisper. I don't have words to express how deeply sorry. You look tired, Dorothy interrupted gently. She studied his delivery uniform, his worn shoes, his defeated posture. Life has been difficult since that day, hasn't it? The unexpected compassion in her tone nearly broke Marcus completely. He had prepared himself for anger, condemnation, even vindictive satisfaction, but kindness that he couldn't handle. I lost everything, Marcus heard himself say, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. My job, my marriage, my home, my career, my reputation, everything. And I deserved it. Every single consequence. What I did to you was unconscionable. Dorothy was quiet for several long moments, just watching him with those knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense he'd ever constructed. Mr. Harrison, may I tell you something about the day my son died? Marcus nodded, unable to speak. Daniel passed away on a Tuesday morning in October 23 years ago. It was raining. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath. He was 25 years old, and he told me with his dying words that he forgave Gerald Pritchard for denying the loan that might have saved his life. Can you imagine that? My beautiful boy, dying because of someone else's cruelty and prejudice, and he spent his final moments trying to free me from hatred. Tears streamed down Marcus's face, hot and unstoppable. Daniel told me that carrying anger would poison whatever life I had left, and that the only way to honor his memory was to be better than the people who hurt us. So I've spent 23 years trying to do exactly that, trying to be kind even when others are cruel, trying to see the humanity in people even when they can't see it in themselves.
how? Marcus choked out the question. How can you possibly look at me with anything except hatred? Dorothy picked up one of her grocery bags and walked slowly toward him. When she reached Marcus, she set the bag down and looked directly into his tear-filled eyes. Because I see someone who's learning what I learned 23 years ago, that losing everything material doesn't mean losing everything important.
That hitting bottom is sometimes the only way to understand what really matters. That compassion and dignity have nothing to do with wealth or status. I don't deserve your kindness. Maybe not, Dorothy agreed softly, but I'm offering it anyway. Not because you've earned it, but because that's who my son taught me to be. And Mr. Harrison, the question isn't whether you deserve it. The question is what you're going to do with this second chance. She picked up her grocery bag, returned to her car, and drove away, leaving Marcus standing alone in that parking lot, crying like he hadn't cried since childhood. For the first time since that terrible Tuesday, Marcus understood that Dorothy Washington hadn't destroyed his life. She had given him the opportunity to finally build a real one. The encounter with Dorothy Washington in that parking lot fundamentally changed something deep inside Marcus Harrison. For the first time in his adult life, he had experienced genuine compassion from someone who had every right to hate him. That night, lying awake in his cramped studio apartment, Marcus replayed their conversation endlessly, examining each word Dorothy had spoken as if they contained some hidden code to understanding what his life had become. The question is, what you're going to do with this second chance. Dorothy's words echoed through his mind, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. A second chance. But a second chance to do what exactly? To rebuild his banking career, to reconstruct the life of privilege and arrogance that had led him to destroy that check and humiliate an innocent woman. The very thought made Marcus physically sick. Over the following weeks, something truly remarkable began happening to Marcus. His perspective, which had been so rigid and narrow for nearly 4 decades, started expanding in ways he couldn't have imagined possible. Working as a delivery driver, a job he had once considered beneath contempt, became an unexpected education in human dignity and struggle. He delivered meals to single mothers working double shifts who couldn't afford to cook. He brought groceries to elderly people too frail to shop for themselves. He carried restaurant orders to families celebrating birthdays in modest apartments that could barely fit everyone around the table. Each delivery revealed lives being lived with grace and determination despite circumstances that would have broken the old Marcus completely. One particular evening, Marcus delivered Chinese food to a woman named Rosa Martinez who lived on the 4th floor of a building without an elevator. Rosa was in her 70s, recovering from hip surgery, and she opened her door with obvious pain etched across her face. When Marcus handed her the food, she insisted on giving him a $5 tip despite the fact that her apartment contained almost no furniture and her clothes were visibly worn. "Thank you for climbing all those stairs," Rosa said warmly. "Most delivery people complain about the walk up. You didn't say one negative word." Marcus was so deeply moved by her kindness and her generosity, despite obvious poverty, that he found himself returning the $5 immediately. "Please keep it, ma'am. You need it more than I do." Rosa looked at him with surprise and something that might have been recognition of a shared humanity. "You're a good man. Your mama raised you right." Walking back down those stairs, Marcus cried for the 3rd time since his termination. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that this woman, who had almost nothing material, possessed more dignity and grace than he had shown during 15 years of banking success. The transformation accelerating within Marcus wasn't comfortable or easy. It required him to confront truths about himself that were brutal and humiliating. He had spent his entire adult life measuring human worth by external markers of success, treating kindness as weakness, and viewing compassion as something only unsuccessful people could afford to practice. 6 months after losing everything, Marcus was working an evening shift when he received a delivery order that made his hands tremble. The address was in Forest Hills, the exclusive neighborhood where he and Catherine had lived in their 5-bedroom house. The same streets he had driven through daily in his BMW, the same restaurants where he had dined weekly, the same country club where he had played golf every Saturday morning. Marcus almost called his supervisor to request a different driver handle the delivery, but something stopped him. Maybe it was curiosity about how much he had changed. Maybe it was a desire to face his past directly. Maybe it was simply the knowledge that running from discomfort had never solved anything. He drove slowly through Forest Hills, his beat-up Honda looking absurdly out of place among the Mercedes and Lexus vehicles lining the immaculate streets. The delivery was to a house 3 blocks from his former residence, a massive colonial with perfectly manicured lawns and a 3-car garage. The man who answered the door was someone Marcus recognized immediately: Richard Sutton, a former client from his banking days. Richard was a commercial real estate developer worth somewhere north of $20 million. Marcus had personally handled several of Richard's accounts, always treating him with the obsequious respect reserved for the extremely wealthy. Richard looked at Marcus with zero recognition. Why would he? To Richard, delivery drivers were invisible, interchangeable, beneath notice. Marcus handed over the food, received a $2 tip that Richard didn't even hand over directly, but left in an envelope by the door, and walked back to his car with tears streaming down his face once again, because he finally understood. He had spent 15 years being Richard Sutton to people like Rosa Martinez. He had treated servers, janitors, delivery people, bank customers in worn clothing, elderly women with old purses, all of them with the same dismissive contempt Richard had just shown him. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He walked into the Community Hope Center, a shelter and resource center for homeless individuals and struggling families, and asked to speak to the director. A tired-looking woman in her 50s named Patricia Davis met him in a cluttered office that smelled of coffee and desperation. "I want to volunteer," Marcus said simply. "I have time every morning before my delivery shifts start. I can do whatever you need." Patricia studied him carefully, her experienced eyes reading the sincerity in his face. Most volunteers quit after a week. The work is hard, emotionally draining, and completely thankless. "Why do you want to do this?" "Because I need to learn how to be human," Marcus answered honestly. "I spent 40 years not knowing how, and someone recently gave me a second chance to figure it out." Patricia nodded slowly. "Okay then, come back tomorrow at 6 in the morning. We serve breakfast to about 200 people daily. You'll help in the kitchen and serving line." The work was exactly as Patricia described: hard, draining, and thankless. Marcus spent his mornings washing dishes, chopping vegetables, serving oatmeal and eggs to people whose lives had fallen apart in ways that made his own difficulties look trivial. Men who had lost everything to addiction. Women fleeing domestic violence with children in tow. Veterans struggling with trauma and mental illness. Elderly people who had outlived their savings and their support systems. Each face told a story. Each person carried burdens that would have crushed the old Marcus within days. But what struck Marcus most powerfully was the dignity that persisted even in the darkest circumstances. People said please and thank you. They helped each other. They shared whatever little they had. They laughed and told jokes and maintained their humanity despite a world that had largely given up on them. Marcus began arriving earlier each morning, staying later, taking on additional responsibilities. He learned names, heard stories, offered what little comfort he could provide. He stopped seeing homeless individuals as a category and started seeing them as Tom, who had been a teacher before his schizophrenia diagnosis destroyed his career. As Maria, who had worked 3 jobs until cancer treatment bankrupted her. As James, a veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and came home to a country that had forgotten him. One morning, while serving breakfast, Marcus looked up to find an elderly man watching him intently from the serving line. The man was probably in his 70s, with a weathered face and intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever defenses Marcus might have maintained. "You're new to this," the man said, not as a question but as an observation. "I can tell. You haven't built up the calluses yet." "Calluses?" Marcus asked, scooping eggs onto the man's plate. "The emotional ones. Most volunteers develop them after a few weeks. They learn to not really see us, to serve food without actually connecting. Self-protection, I suppose. But you're still looking at us like we're real people. That won't last." "Why not?" The old man smiled sadly. "Because it hurts too much. Seeing us as human means feeling our pain, and most people can't sustain that without shutting down." "What's your name?" Marcus asked, determined to prove this man wrong. "Harold. Harold Peterson. I was an accountant for 40 years before my wife got sick. Medical bills destroyed everything. She died anyway. That was 8 years ago." Marcus extended his hand across the serving line. "I'm Marcus Harrison. I was a bank manager for 15 years before I destroyed my life through cruelty and arrogance. That was 7 months ago." Harold shook his hand firmly, something shifting in his expression. "Well, Marcus Harrison, welcome to the land of second chances. Most people never make it here. They just keep repeating the same mistakes until they die. The fact that you're here means something." Over the following months, Marcus developed a friendship with Harold that taught him more about grace and wisdom than any business school or professional development seminar ever had. Harold had lost everything material but retained something Marcus was only beginning to understand: a sense of self-worth, completely divorced from external circumstances. Harold explained it one morning while they were both washing dishes after the breakfast rush. The difference between people who survive losing everything and people who don't isn't about resources or luck. It's about whether you built your identity on what you have or who you are. You built yours on what you had, so losing it felt like death. But it wasn't death, Marcus. It was birth. You're finally becoming a real person. 9 months after his termination from Riverside Bank, Marcus was working both his delivery job and his volunteer work when Patricia Davis pulled him aside after the breakfast service. She looked nervous, which was unusual for someone so naturally composed. "Marcus, I need to tell you something. Someone's been asking questions about you." Marcus felt his stomach clench. "What kind of questions?" "About your volunteer work here, about how you treat people, about whether your transformation seems genuine." Patricia paused. It was Dorothy Washington. Marcus's heart stopped completely. "She's been checking up on me? For 3 months now. She never identified herself, always sent proxies. But I finally figured out who was behind the inquiries." Patricia handed him a sealed envelope. "She asked me to give you this if I believed your change was real. I'm giving it to you." Marcus's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter on simple stationery. "Dear Marcus, if you're reading this, it means Patricia believes you've truly changed. I hope she's right. I hope you've learned what my son Daniel tried to teach me with his dying words, that compassion isn't weakness, that dignity isn't determined by wealth, and that second chances are precious gifts not to be wasted. I'd like to have coffee with you. If you're willing, meet me Saturday morning at 10 at Corner Bakery on Main Street. There's something I'd like to discuss. With hope for your continued journey, Dorothy Washington." Marcus read the letter 5 times, tears blurring the words. Dorothy had been watching him, not to punish him further, but to see if he could become someone different, someone better, someone worthy of the second chance she had offered in that parking lot. For the first time since that terrible Tuesday morning when he had torn up her check, Marcus felt something powerful he hadn't experienced in his entire adult life. He felt genuine hope that he might actually be becoming a person worth respecting. Saturday morning arrived with crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. Marcus woke before dawn, stomach churning with anticipation about meeting Dorothy Washington. He had barely slept, rehearsing what he might say. At 9:30, Marcus stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his only dress shirt. It was wrinkled but clean. His reflection showed a man fundamentally different from the arrogant bank manager of 10 months earlier. His face carried lines of genuine humility earned through hard work. His eyes, once cold with judgment, now held warmth born from truly seeing other people. Corner Bakery on Main Street was a modest establishment that served excellent coffee and fresh pastries. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, too anxious to wait any longer. He ordered a simple coffee and sat at a table near the window, watching people pass by. At exactly 10 o'clock, Dorothy Washington walked through the door. She wore simple clothing, Marcus remembered, and she carried that worn leather bag that held her son's memory. But something about her presence seemed lighter today, as if some burden she had carried for decades had finally begun to ease. Marcus stood immediately, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it loudly in his ears. "Mrs. Washington, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Dorothy smiled with genuine warmth and gently gestured for him to sit. "Please, Marcus, call me Dorothy. I think we're past formalities at this point." They sat across from each other in comfortable silence for several moments. Dorothy ordered tea and a scone, moving with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned that the most important conversations could never be rushed. "You look different," Dorothy finally said, studying Marcus's face with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see everything. "Not just thinner or more tired. Different in a way that goes deeper than appearance." "I am different," Marcus replied honestly. "I barely recognize the person I was 10 months ago. That man was a stranger to me now, someone I'm ashamed to have been. Tell me about your work at Community Hope Center. Patricia Davis speaks very highly of you." Marcus felt his cheeks flush. "I didn't know you had been checking on me until Patricia gave me your letter. Everything I've been doing wasn't performed for your benefit or to earn back anything. I've been doing it because I finally understood something fundamental about being human." "And what did you understand?" "That a person's worth has nothing to do with their bank account or job title. That dignity isn't something wealth provides. It's something every human deserves. That compassion isn't weakness. It's the strongest thing any person can practice." Marcus paused, voice thick with emotion. "I spent 40 years not understanding these truths. Your son Daniel understood them at 25. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "Daniel would have liked you. This version of you, I mean. He always believed people could change if they were willing to face their ugliest truths about themselves." "Dorothy, I need to say something I've been carrying for months. I destroyed your check and humiliated you publicly because I looked at your clothing and your bag and decided you weren't worthy of basic human respect. That wasn't a mistake or an error in judgment. That was a revelation of who I actually was at my core. I was a terrible person who treated human beings like obstacles or resources rather than people with feelings and dignity." "Was," Dorothy repeated softly. "You use past tense. Do you believe you're no longer that person?" Marcus considered the question carefully, understanding its weight. "I believe I'm becoming someone different, someone better. But I also understand that transformation isn't a destination. It's a daily choice. Every morning I wake up and have to decide who I'm going to be. Some days it's easier than others. But I'm trying, Dorothy. I'm really trying to be someone who treats every human being with the respect they deserve." Dorothy reached across the table and took Marcus's hand in both of hers. Her skin was soft and warm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Marcus, I asked you here today because I wanted to tell you something important, something I've realized over the past few months while watching your journey." Marcus waited, barely breathing. "When you destroyed that check and humiliated me in the bank, I wanted to destroy you completely. I wanted you to lose everything and suffer in ways that would match the suffering I experienced when Daniel died. And for a while, I got exactly what I wanted. You lost your job, your marriage, your home, your reputation, everything you valued. I deserved all of it. Perhaps, Dorothy acknowledged. But here's what I realized while watching you work at the Hope Center, while hearing stories about how you treat people during your delivery work, while seeing you genuinely transform instead of just performing transformation. Revenge doesn't heal anything. Punishment doesn't bring back what we've lost. The only thing that actually matters is whether people learn and grow and become forces for good in the world. Dorothy, let me finish, she said gently but firmly. My son died because someone prioritized money over human life. For 23 years, I carried rage about that decision. But you know what Daniel's actual final words to me were? Not the sanitized version I told you before, but his actual last words? Marcus shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He said, "Mom, don't waste your life hating Mr. Pritchard. He's already lost because he doesn't know how to love people. You won your life because you do. Promise me you'll remember that." Dorothy's voice broke completely. And I tried, Marcus. For 23 years I tried to honor that promise. But I never fully succeeded until I watched you transform from someone who didn't know how to love people into someone who is learning. What are you saying? Dorothy opened her worn leather bag and pulled out an envelope. But unlike the letter she had sent through Patricia, this envelope was official-looking, bearing the letterhead of Henderson and Associates, the same law firm that had issued her original check. "This is a check made out to Community Hope Center for $50,000, Dorothy said, placing the envelope on the table. "It's the exact amount of the check you destroyed. I'm donating it in memory of my son Daniel, and in honor of your transformation. Patricia tells me that amount would fund their breakfast program for an entire year." Marcus stared at the envelope, overwhelmed by the symbolism. Dorothy was taking the money he had destroyed and using it to feed the people he now served. The poetry of it was almost too much to bear. "But there's a condition," Dorothy continued. "I want you to personally deliver this check to Patricia. I want you to explain to her that it comes from someone who understands what it means to lose everything and find something more valuable in the loss. And I want you to continue volunteering there, not because I'm asking you to, but because that's who you're becoming. Dorothy, I don't know what to say." "This is incredibly generous. Say that you'll keep becoming the person you're meant to be. Say that you'll remember that every person you meet, no matter how they look or what they wear or what their circumstances are, deserves the same dignity and respect you want for yourself. Say that you'll honor my son's memory by treating people the way Daniel treated everyone, with open-hearted compassion." "I promise," Marcus whispered. "I swear to you I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of this second chance you've given me." Dorothy stood, preparing to leave, but Marcus reached out and gently touched her arm. "Wait, there's something I need to ask you." "Why? Why did you give me this chance when you could have destroyed me completely? Why show mercy to someone who showed you none?" Dorothy smiled with a wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world. "Because, Marcus, I learned something from losing my son and watching my husband dedicate his life to reforming a bank that had failed our family. I learned that the only way to break cycles of cruelty is through acts of radical compassion. Gerald Pritchard's cruelty killed my son. My cruelty could have killed your spirit permanently. But I chose differently because Daniel taught me that love is always stronger than hate, that mercy is always more powerful than revenge, and that giving people chances to become better is the only thing that actually changes the world." Marcus stood and did something he never would have dared 10 months earlier. He embraced Dorothy Washington, this woman he had humiliated and degraded, and he wept openly while she held him with a mother's compassion. "Thank you," Marcus whispered into her shoulder. "Thank you for seeing something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." "You're welcome, Marcus. Now go become the man you were always meant to be." As Dorothy walked out of the bakery and disappeared into the autumn morning, Marcus sat back down and stared at the envelope containing $50,000. But what he saw wasn't money. What he saw was a roadmap to redemption written in compassion and sealed with mercy. He thought about Harold Peterson, the homeless accountant who had taught him about dignity divorced from circumstances. He thought about Rosa Martinez, who had tipped him $5 she couldn't afford because kindness mattered more to her than money. He thought about the hundreds of faces at Community Hope Center, each representing a human being worthy of love and respect, regardless of their situation. And he thought about Daniel Washington, a young man he had never met, but whose death and final words had somehow reached across 23 years to save Marcus's soul from permanent darkness. That afternoon, Marcus delivered the check to Patricia Davis. He explained everything to her, holding nothing back about his past cruelty or his ongoing journey toward becoming a better person. Patricia cried and hugged him and told him that the breakfast program would now be able to serve nearly twice as many people. 1 year after that terrible Tuesday when he destroyed Dorothy's check, Marcus Harrison was still working as a delivery driver, still volunteering at Community Hope Center, still learning what it meant to treat every person with dignity. He had not regained his banking career or wealthy lifestyle, but for the first time in 41 years, Marcus Harrison was genuinely happy, because he had finally learned the most important lesson any human being can learn, that true wealth isn't measured by what we possess, but by who we are when nobody is watching. That real success isn't about climbing ladders or accumulating status, but about how we treat the people who can do nothing for us. That authentic happiness comes not from being served, but from serving others with grace and love. Dorothy Washington had given him something infinitely more valuable than money or career or status. She had given him his humanity back, and Marcus spent every remaining day of his life trying to honor that gift by being kind to everyone, judging no one, and understanding that we are all just human beings doing our best with the circumstances we've been given. Some people are born knowing these truths. Others, like Marcus, have to lose everything to finally understand them. But the important thing is that we learn, that we grow, that we become better, that we choose compassion over cruelty, mercy over judgment, and love over hate every single day for the rest of our lives.